The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training compound as Staff Sergeant Marcus Tank Rodriguez strutted through the mess hall with his characteristic swagger. At 6'3" and built like a fortress, Tank commanded respect wherever he went. His Navy SEAL insignia gleamed on his uniform, a constant reminder to everyone around him of his elite status. He had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, earned multiple commendations, and possessed the kind of reputation that made junior officers step aside when he walked down corridors. Tank's morning routine was legendary among the troops stationed at Camp Lejeune. He would arrive at the mess hall precisely at 063 hours, survey the room like a predator sizing up territory, and then proceed to regale anyone within earshot with stories of his combat exploits. The younger soldiers hung on his every word, their eyes wide with admiration and perhaps a touch of fear. Tank thrived on this attention, feeding off the respect and intimidation he commanded. On this particular Tuesday morning, however, something was different. Seated alone at a corner table was a woman Tank had never seen before. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, with short auburn hair and an athletic build that suggested military training. What caught Tank's attention wasn't her appearance, but rather her complete indifference to his presence. While every other person in the mess hall had glanced his way when he entered, she continued eating her breakfast and reading what appeared to be a technical manual. The woman wore civilian clothes, but there was something about her posture and the way she carried herself that screamed military. Her back was straight, her movements precise and economical. She sat facing the entrance, maintaining situational awareness even while appearing relaxed. Tank's curiosity was piqued, but more than that, his ego was slightly bruised by her apparent dismissal of his presence. Tank approached the serving line, loading his tray with the usual fare while keeping one eye on the mysterious woman. As he moved through the mess hall, he made sure his path would take him directly past her table. The conversations around him quieted as soldiers anticipated another one of Tank's impromptu storytelling sessions. But today, his attention was focused elsewhere. "Morning, miss," Tank said, stopping beside her table with his trademark confident smile. "Haven't seen you around here before. I'm Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Navy SEAL Team 6. The woman looked up from her manual, her green eyes meeting his with a steady, unimpressed gaze. "Good morning," she replied simply, then returned her attention to her reading. Tank's smile faltered slightly. He wasn't accustomed to such a lukewarm reception, especially when he mentioned his SEAL credentials. "You new to the base?" he pressed, setting his tray down on her table without invitation. "Something like that," she answered, not looking up this time. The dismissive response sent a ripple of surprise through the nearby tables. Several soldiers exchanged glances, unused to seeing their legendary staff sergeant receive such a cold shoulder. Tank's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he maintained his composure. "Well, let me officially welcome you to Camp Lejeune," Tank continued, his voice carrying just a hint of edge. "This is a serious military installation, and we like to know who's sharing our space, especially civilians who seem to have unrestricted access to our facilities." The woman finally closed her manual and looked up at him fully. There was something in her expression that Tank couldn't quite read, not fear, not intimidation, but something that made him slightly uncomfortable. "I appreciate the welcome, Staff Sergeant. I'm Sarah Chen, and I'm here on official business." "Official business," Tank repeated, settling into the chair across from her despite not being invited. "That's pretty vague. What kind of official business requires a civilian to have access to a restricted military mess hall?" Sarah's expression remained neutral, but several soldiers noticed her hands resting calmly on the table in a way that suggested complete readiness for any situation. "The kind that's above your clearance level, Staff Sergeant." The comment hit Tank like a physical blow. In his years of service, very few people had ever spoken to him with such casual authority. The implication that this unknown woman might have higher security clearance than a Navy SEAL was both insulting and intriguing. "Above my clearance level?" Tank's voice rose slightly, drawing more attention from the surrounding tables. "Lady, I've been in places and done things that would give you nightmares. I've completed missions that most people will never even know happened. There's very little in this military that's above my clearance level." There tested his coffee cup and took a measured sip before responding. "I'm sure you've had quite an impressive career, Staff Sergeant, but my work here doesn't require your involvement or approval. The mess hall had grown noticeably quieter as more soldiers became aware of the unusual confrontation taking place. Tank was known for his ability to dominate any conversation, to make anyone feel small with his presence and credentials. Yet this civilian woman seemed completely unaffected by his intimidation tactics. Tank leaned forward, his voice dropping to what he considered a menacing whisper. "Listen here, sweetheart. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this is my house. These are my troops, my base, my territory. And I don't appreciate some mystery woman walking in here acting like she owns the place." For the first time since the conversation began, Sarah's expression shifted. The neutral mask slipped slightly, revealing something that made Tank immediately regret his choice of words. It wasn't anger or fear in her eyes, but rather the kind of cold calculation he'd only seen in the faces of the most dangerous people he'd encountered in combat. "Your house." Sarah's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. "Your troops? That's an interesting perspective, Staff Sergeant." Tank realized he'd overstepped, but his pride prevented him from backing down. In front of over 100 military personnel, he couldn't afford to appear weak or intimidated by a civilian. His reputation was everything in this environment, and he felt it slipping away with each word this woman spoke. "That's right," Tank doubled down, his voice returning to normal volume. "And in my house, we show respect to decorated veterans who've earned their place here through blood, sweat, and sacrifice." Sarah stood up slowly, and Tank was surprised to realize she was taller than he'd initially thought, probably around 5'8", with a frame that suggested serious physical conditioning. She began gathering her things with deliberate care, each movement precise and controlled. "Respect is earned, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, not demanded. And it's certainly not granted based on how loudly someone announces their credentials." The comment drew a few barely suppressed chuckles from some of the younger soldiers, which only fueled Tank's growing frustration. He stood as well, using his considerable height advantage to loom over her. "You want to see credentials?" Tank's voice carried across the now silent mess hall. "I've got 3 Purple Hearts, 2 Bronze Stars, and more confirmed kills than you've got years on this planet. I've fought Taliban fighters in mountains so remote they don't have names, and I've completed underwater demolition missions that pushed the limits of human endurance. So maybe you should think twice before dismissing what I've accomplished." Sarah finished packing her materials and looked up at him with that same unreadable expression. "That's quite impressive, Staff Sergeant. Your service record speaks for itself." For a moment, Tank felt vindicated. Finally, this woman was showing him the respect he deserved. But then she continued speaking, and her next words would set in motion a chain of events that would become legendary throughout the military community. "However, your service record also includes 3 formal reprimands for conduct unbecoming an officer, 2 incidents of insubordination, and a pattern of behavior that suggests you believe your military achievements give you license to treat others as inferior." The mess hall was now completely silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of kitchen staff cleaning dishes. Tank felt the blood drain from his face as he realized this woman had access to his complete military file, information that was supposed to be classified and available only to his direct command structure. "How do you?" Tank began, but Sarah cut him off. "As I mentioned, Staff Sergeant, I'm here on official business. Business that gives me access to a great deal of information about the personnel stationed at this facility." Tank's mind raced as he tried to process what was happening. Who was this woman? How did she have access to his classified records? And more importantly, what kind of authority did she represent? "Now," Sarah continued, slinging her bag over her shoulder, "I believe this conversation has run its course. I have work to do, and I'm sure you have duties to attend to as well." She moved a step around him, but Tank's pride and confusion got the better of his judgment. Without thinking, he reached out and grabbed her arm to stop her from leaving. "We're not done here," he said firmly. "You don't get to drop bombshells about classified information and then just walk away." The moment Tank's hand made contact with Sarah's arm, the atmosphere in the mess hall shifted dramatically. Every soldier present recognized they were witnessing something unprecedented. A physical confrontation involving their legendary staff sergeant and a mysterious civilian woman who seemed to possess impossible authority. Sarah looked down at Tank's hand on her arm, then back up at his face, When she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried clearly through the silent room. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, I'm going to give you exactly 3 seconds to remove your hand from my person." "Or what? You'll file a complaint? Report me to my commanding officer?" "Lady, I've been through more disciplinary procedures than you've had hot dinners." Sarah's expression didn't change, but somehow the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. 3. Tank's military training should have kicked in at this point. He should have recognized the signs of someone who was not only unafraid, but actually welcoming a physical confrontation. But his ego and the audience of over 1,000 troops prevented him from making the smart choice. 2. The single word hung in the air like a death sentence. Several of the more experienced soldiers began shifting in their seats, their instincts telling them they were about to witness something they'd never forget. 1. Tank's response would become the stuff of military legend, repeated in mess halls and barracks around the world for years to come. Instead of releasing her arm, he tightened his grip and leaned closer to her face. "Remember, I'm a Navy SEAL," he declared loudly, ensuring every person in the mess hall could hear him clearly. What happened next would be talked about, analyzed, and embellished for decades to come, but the basic facts would never be disputed by the 1040 military personnel who witnessed it firsthand. The instant Tank finished declaring his Navy SEAL status, Sarah's response was swift, precise, and utterly devastating. In one fluid motion that most witnesses would later describe as almost too fast to follow, she twisted her arm free from his grip, while simultaneously executing a perfect counterattack that exploited Tank's overconfident positioning. Her right hand shot upward in a palm strike that connected with Tank's jaw at exactly the right angle and velocity. The technique was flawless, not the wild swing of an amateur, but the calculated strike of someone who had trained extensively in hand-to-hand combat. Tank's head snapped back from the impact, his eyes going wide with shock and pain. But Sarah wasn't finished. As Tank staggered backward from the palm strike, she followed through with a low sweep that caught his legs at precisely the moment when his balance was most compromised. The 6'3", 220-pound Navy SEAL went down hard, his body hitting the mess hall floor with a resounding crash that echoed through the stunned silence. Tank tried to push himself back up, his military training and pride refusing to accept what had just happened. But as he raised his head, Sarah's boot connected with his solar plexus in a controlled strike that drove all the air from his lungs and sent him crashing back to the floor, gasping and wheezing. The entire sequence had taken less than 4 seconds. Tank lay on the cold linoleum floor, struggling to breathe and trying to process what had just occurred. His vision was slightly blurred from the initial strike, and his diaphragm was spasming from the final blow to his midsection. Around him, over 1,000 military personnel sat in complete, stunned silence. Sarah stood over him, her breathing completely normal, her posture relaxed but ready. There was no satisfaction in her expression, no gloating or triumph. She simply looked down at the fallen SEAL with the same neutral expression she'd maintained throughout their entire conversation. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," she said calmly, her voice carrying clearly through the silent mess hall. "When someone asks you to remove your hand, the appropriate response is compliance, not escalation." Tank tried to respond, but he was still struggling to get enough air back into his lungs to speak. He rolled onto his side, coughing and gasping, his face flushed with a combination of oxygen deprivation and humiliation. The silence stretched on as every person in the mess hall tried to process what they had just witnessed. Staff Sergeant Marcus Tank Rodriguez, the legendary Navy SEAL who had become a symbol of military prowess and masculinity, had been decisively and effortlessly defeated by a civilian woman who appeared to be half his size. Major Jennifer Walsh, the mess hall duty officer, was the first to break from her shock. She stood up from her table and began moving toward the confrontation, her training finally overriding her amazement at what she had just seen. "Stand down," Major Walsh called out, though it was unclear who the order was directed toward since the fight was already clearly over. "Everyone remain seated and maintain order." Sarah looked up at the approaching major and nodded respectfully. "Good morning, Major Walsh. I apologize for the disruption to your facility." Major Walsh stopped short, surprised that this woman knew her name and rank. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification and understand exactly what just happened here." Sarah reached into her jacket and withdrew a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal credentials that made Major Walsh's eyes widen considerably. The Major examined the identification carefully, her expression growing more concerned with each passing second. "I see," Major Walsh said quietly, handing the credentials back. "Ma'am, I had no idea you were. I wasn't informed of your presence on the base." "That's quite all right, Major. My visit wasn't scheduled through normal channels." Sarah glanced down at Tank, who was finally managing to get some air back into his lungs. "I had hoped to conduct my business here without any incidents, but Staff Sergeant Rodriguez seemed determined to make that impossible." By this time, Tank had managed to push himself up into a sitting position, though he was still breathing heavily and his face remained flushed. The physical pain was bad enough, but the psychological impact of what had just occurred was far worse. His entire identity, his sense of self-worth, his reputation among the troops, everything that made him who he was, had been shattered in less than 5 seconds. "What the hell are you?" Tank wheezed, looking up at Sarah with a mixture of confusion, anger, and something that might have been fear. Sarah looked down at him with that same neutral expression. "I'm someone who doesn't appreciate being manhandled by overly aggressive personnel, regardless of their service record or military credentials."
Major Walsh cleared her throat nervously.
"Ma'am, perhaps we should continue this conversation in a more private setting. The dining facility isn't the appropriate venue for— Actually, Major, I think this is exactly the appropriate venue," Sarah interrupted gently but firmly. "What happened here serves as an important lesson for everyone present." She turned to address the room full of soldiers, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the mess hall. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've just witnessed is what happens when someone allows their ego to override their judgment and their respect for others. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez is undoubtedly a skilled and experienced military professional, but his accomplishments don't give him the right to physically intimidate or assault anyone, regardless of their gender or apparent civilian status." Tank finally managed to get to his feet, though he was still unsteady and clearly shaken. His uniform was disheveled, his pride was in tatters, and he was acutely aware that over 1,000 troops had just watched him get demolished by someone he had dismissed as a harmless civilian. "This isn't over," Tank said, his voice hoarse and his breathing still labored. "I don't know who you think you are, but— Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," Major Walsh interrupted sharply, "I strongly advise you to stop talking and report to my office immediately for debriefing." But Tank was beyond rational thought at this point. The humiliation was too complete, too public, and too devastating to his carefully constructed image. He had spent years building his reputation as an invincible warrior, and in less than 5 seconds, a woman he'd never met had reduced him to a gasping, defeated figure on the mess hall floor. "I want to know who authorized you to be here," Tank demanded, ignoring his commanding officer's directive. "I want to know what agency you work for, and I want to know what gives you the right to assault a decorated military veteran." Sarah's expression finally shifted slightly, showing the first hint of amusement she had displayed since the confrontation began. "Assault? Staff Sergeant, you grabbed me first. What I did was simply defend myself against unwanted physical contact. Every person in this room witnessed the entire sequence of events. She was absolutely right, and everyone knew it. The video surveillance system had undoubtedly recorded the entire incident, and there were over 1,000 witnesses who had seen Tank initiate the physical contact. Sarah's response, while devastatingly effective, had been purely defensive in nature. "Furthermore," Sarah continued, "my authorization to be here comes from significantly higher up the chain of command than anyone stationed at this facility. If you'd like to challenge that authorization, I encourage you to contact your base commander and request clarification." Tank looked around the mess hall at the faces of the soldiers he had commanded and impressed for so many years. Where once he had seen respect and admiration, he now saw shock, confusion, and in some cases barely concealed amusement. The younger troops who had hung on his every word just minutes earlier were now whispering among themselves and stealing glances at both him and Sarah. The psychological impact of the defeat was multiplied by the very public nature of the humiliation. Tank realized that this moment would define him for the rest of his military career. No matter what he accomplished going forward, he would always be remembered as the Navy SEAL who got knocked out by a mysterious civilian woman in front of over 1,000 troops. "This is impossible," Tank said. more to himself than to anyone else. This doesn't happen.
Navy SEALs don't get doubling D. Navy SEALs are human beings, Staff Sergeant, Sarah said quietly. They're highly trained, extremely capable human beings, but they're not invincible.
They're not immune to mistakes, poor judgment, or the consequences of their actions. And they're certainly not exempt from being held accountable when they choose to physically intimidate others.
Major Walsh was growing increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation and the continued attention it was drawing from the entire dining facility. Ma'am, with your permission, I'd like to clear the mess hall and continue this discussion in a more appropriate setting.
Major, what happened here today needs to be witnessed and understood by everyone present. Too often, incidents like this are swept under the rug or handled behind closed doors, which allows the underlying problems to persist.
She turned back to face Tank, who was slowly regaining his composure but still looked shell-shocked by the experience. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, you've spent years cultivating an image of invincibility and using your military credentials to intimidate others. Today, you learned that everyone has limitations, and everyone can be held accountable for their actions. Tank wanted to argue, wanted to defend himself and his reputation, but he was beginning to realize just how deep a hole he had dug for himself. Not only had he been physically defeated in the most public way possible, but he was also starting to understand that this woman represented some kind of authority that was far beyond his ability to challenge or intimidate. "Who are you?" he asked again, this time with genuine curiosity rather than aggression. Sarah checked her watch and picked up her bag. "I'm someone who believes that respect should be based on character and actions, not just on military decorations or physical intimidation. I'm someone who thinks that true strength comes from knowing when to use force and when to show restraint." She looked around the mess hall one final time, her gaze taking in the faces of all the soldiers who had witnessed the confrontation. "And I'm someone who believes that the military is strongest when it's built on mutual respect and professional conduct, not on hierarchies maintained through bullying and intimidation." With that, Sarah began walking toward the exit, her movements as calm and controlled as they had been throughout the entire encounter. The sea of soldiers parted before her, creating a clear path to the door. Tank watched her go, his mind racing with questions, and his pride still reeling from the defeat. He knew that this moment would haunt him for the rest of his career, but he was beginning to realize that it might also teach him something important about himself and the way he had been treating others. As Sarah reached the door, she paused and turned back one final time. Her voice carried clearly across the silent mess hall as she delivered what would become the most quoted line from the entire incident. "Remember, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, being a Navy SEAL, doesn't give you the right to put your hands on people who haven't given you permission to do so." And with that, she was gone, leaving behind a mess hall full of stunned military personnel and one very humbled Navy SEAL who would never quite look at himself the same way again. The mess hall remained in stunned silence for nearly 5 full minutes after Sarah's departure. Over 1,000 military personnel sat frozen in their seats, processing what they had just witnessed. The only sounds were the distant clatter of kitchen equipment and Tank's still labored breathing as he stood in the center of the room, his uniform wrinkled and his legendary reputation in ruins. Major Walsh was the first to recover her composure. "All personnel will return to their normal duties immediately," she announced in a voice that brooked no argument. "What transpired here this morning is not to be discussed outside of this facility pending a full investigation. Anyone found spreading rumors or unauthorized accounts of this incident will face disciplinary action." But even as she gave the order, Major Walsh knew it was futile. In the age of smartphones and social media, news traveled faster than military regulations could contain it. Within hours, every military base in the country would know about the Navy SEAL who got knocked out by a mysterious civilian woman. By the end of the week, the story would have spread throughout the entire military community worldwide. Tank slowly made his way to an empty table, his legs still unsteady from the encounter. He sat down heavily, his head in his hands, trying to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. Around him, soldiers began filing out of the mess hall in small groups, their conversations hushed but animated. He could feel their eyes on him, could sense their whispered discussions, and knew that his life would never be the same. Staff Sergeant Jenny Martinez, one of Tank's longtime colleagues, approached his table cautiously. She had known Marcus Rodriguez for over 8 years, had served alongside him in Afghanistan, and had always respected his skills and experience. But she had also witnessed his increasingly problematic behavior toward junior personnel and civilians over the past few years. "Tank," she said quietly, sitting down across from him. "You okay, man?" Tank looked up at her with hollow eyes. "Did you see what just happened, Jenny? Did you see how fast she moved?" "Yeah, I saw it. We all saw it. I've been in combat for over a decade," Tank continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've fought Taliban fighters, insurgents, trained killers from all over the world, and some random civilian woman just took me down like I was a complete amateur." Jenny studied her friend's face and saw something she'd never seen there before. Genuine humility mixed with fear and confusion. "Tank, I don't think she was just some random civilian." "What do you mean?" "The way she moved, the technique she used, the fact that she had access to your classified military records, that woman was definitely military or intelligence. Probably special operations, maybe even more elite than anything we've seen." Tank's mind began working through the implications. If Sarah Chen was indeed military or intelligence, it would explain her combat skills and access to classified information. But it also raised disturbing questions about why she was investigating him specifically and what kind of authority she represented. "I need to find out who she really is," Tank said, more to himself than to Jenny. "Tank man, I think you need to let this go. Whoever she is, she's clearly operating at a level way above our pay grade. Pushing this further is only going to make things worse for you." But Tank wasn't listening. His pride, though badly wounded, was beginning to reassert itself. The initial shock of the defeat was wearing off, replaced by anger and a desperate need to salvage what remained of his reputation. Meanwhile, in the base commander's office, Colonel James Harrison was receiving a phone call that would provide the answers to many of the questions swirling around the morning's incident. The call came from Pentagon Intelligence, and the information he received made him understand just how serious the situation had become. "Colonel Harrison." The voice on the other end of the line was crisp and authoritative. "We need to discuss the incident that occurred in your mess hall this morning involving Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez and Agent Chen." "Agent Chen?" Colonel Harrison repeated. "Sir, I wasn't aware we had any intelligence agents operating on my base. Agent Sarah Chen is a senior investigator with the Defense Intelligence Agency's Internal Affairs Division. She's been conducting a covert investigation into allegations of misconduct and abuse of authority among special operations personnel at various military installations. If the DIA was investigating misconduct among his special operations personnel, it meant the problems were serious enough to attract attention at the highest levels of military intelligence." "Sir, what specific allegations are we talking about?" "Multiple complaints have been filed against Staff Sergeant Rodriguez over the past 18 months. Sexual harassment, abuse of authority, intimidation of junior personnel, and creating a hostile work environment. Agent Chen was sent to your facility to conduct a preliminary investigation and gather evidence." The colonel closed his eyes and rubbed his temples. He had heard rumors about Tank's behavior, but nothing had ever been officially reported through proper channels. Now he was learning that the problems had escalated to the point where the Defense Intelligence Agency was conducting covert investigations. "What happened in the mess hall this morning, sir?" According to Agent Chen's preliminary report, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez approached her aggressively, made inappropriate comments about her presence on the base, and then physically grabbed her when she attempted to disengage from the conversation. Agent Chen responded with appropriate defensive force to protect herself from what she perceived as a potential assault. Colonel Harrison could feel his career flashing before his eyes. A Navy SEAL under his command had just physically assaulted a DIA investigator in front of over 1,000 witnesses. The political and public relations implications were staggering. "Sir, what are my orders regarding Staff Sergeant Rodriguez?" "He's to be placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation. All of his security clearances are to be suspended, and he's to have no contact with other personnel involved in the investigation." "Understood, sir." "What about the witnesses from this morning's incident?" "Agent Chen will be conducting interviews with selected personnel over the next few days. You're to provide her with full cooperation and access to any resources she requires. After ending the call, Colonel Harrison sat in his office for several minutes, trying to figure out how to handle the situation. He had always prided himself on running a tight ship, but it was becoming clear that serious problems had been festering under his command without his knowledge. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he called out. Major Walsh stepped into the office, her expression grim. "Sir, we need to discuss the incident from this morning." "I'm already aware of the broad details, Major. I've just received a briefing from Pentagon Intelligence." Major Walsh's eyebrows shot up. "Pentagon Intelligence, sir?" "The woman who had the confrontation with Staff Sergeant Rodriguez is Agent Sarah Chen from the Defense Intelligence Agency. She's been conducting an undercover investigation into allegations of misconduct among our Special Operations personnel." "Dear God," Major Walsh whispered. "Sir, do you realize what this means? We've got over 1,000 witnesses to a Navy SEAL assaulting a federal investigator. This is going to be a media nightmare." Colonel Harrison nodded grimly. "I'm very much aware of the implications, Major. I need you to compile a list of all personnel who were present during the incident. Agent Chen will be conducting interviews, and we need to be prepared to provide full cooperation." Meanwhile, back in the mess hall area, Tank had managed to corner several of the soldiers who had witnessed the confrontation. Despite Major Walsh's orders about not discussing the incident, Tank was desperate for information about the mysterious woman who had humiliated him so thoroughly. "Did any of you recognize her?" he asked a group of junior enlisted personnel. "Had anyone seen her on the base before today?" The soldiers exchanged uncomfortable glances. They had all heard Major Walsh's orders about not discussing the incident, but they also didn't want to directly refuse a request from a staff sergeant, even one whose reputation had just taken a devastating hit. "We didn't recognize her, Staff Sergeant," one of the younger soldiers finally answered. "But the way she moved, that wasn't some random civilian. That was serious training." Tank nodded, his suspicions confirmed. "What kind of training do you think? Military? Intelligence? Had to be something special, Staff Sergeant. I've seen a lot of hand-to-hand combat training, and what she did to you, that was next-level stuff." The comment stung, but Tank forced himself to focus on gathering information rather than nursing his wounded pride. "Did anyone hear what she showed to Major Walsh?" Some kind of identification that made the Major back down pretty quickly. The soldiers shook their heads. They had all seen Sarah show her credentials to Major Walsh, but none of them had been close enough to see what was in the wallet. Tank's investigation was interrupted by the appearance of First Sergeant William Hayes, a career military man with over 20 years of experience and a reputation for no-nonsense discipline. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," First Sergeant Hayes said in a voice that immediately commanded attention. "You're to report to Colonel Harrison's office immediately." Tank felt his stomach lurch. Being summoned to the base commander's office so soon after the incident could only mean bad news. "First Sergeant, I can explain what happened this morning." "Staff Sergeant, you're not to discuss the incident with anyone until after you've spoken with the Colonel. Is that understood?" "Yes, First Sergeant." As Tank made his way across the base toward the command building, he noticed that soldiers were stepping aside to let him pass. Not out of respect as they had done in the past, but out of uncomfortable awkwardness. The news of his defeat had already spread throughout the installation, and everyone was uncertain how to interact with their fallen hero. The walk to Colonel Harrison's office gave Tank time to think about his situation and prepare his defense. He planned to explain that he had been acting in the interests of base security, that the woman's presence had seemed suspicious, and that his actions had been reasonable given the circumstances. But as he approached the Colonel's office, Tank had no idea that his entire world was about to change once again. He didn't know that Sarah Chen was a federal investigator, that he was the subject of a formal misconduct investigation, or that his military career was effectively over. When he knocked on Colonel Harrison's door and heard the command to enter, Tank straightened his shoulders and prepared to defend his actions and his reputation. He still believed that being a Navy SEAL meant something, that his service record and combat experience would protect him from the consequences of what had happened in the mess hall. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. Colonel Harrison looked up as Tank entered the office, and the expression on the Colonel's face told Tank everything he needed to know about the seriousness of his situation. This wasn't going to be a routine debriefing or a simple disciplinary action. This was the beginning of the end of everything Tank had worked for and believed about himself. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," Colonel Harrison said in a voice devoid of warmth or familiarity, "please have a seat. We need to discuss your future with the United States Navy." As Tank sat down in the chair across from his commanding officer's desk, he finally began to understand that his encounter with Sarah Chen had been about much more than a simple confrontation in a mess hall. It had been the culmination of years of poor decisions, abuse of authority, and the kind of behavior that the military could no longer tolerate. The Navy SEAL who had walked into the mess hall that morning full of swagger and confidence was gone forever. The man who sat across from Colonel Harrison was about to face the consequences of his actions and learn what it really meant to be held accountable for his conduct. The legend of Tank Rodriguez was over. The reckoning had begun.